Ben Whitaker had lived in Oregon his whole life, the last 15 years in a small weathered bungalow on the edge of Eugene. At 72, his world had settled into a comfortable, predictable rhythm. Early mornings with black coffee on the porch, afternoons tending to his tomatoes and green beans, and the occasional fishing trip to the Willamette River. His pension was enough to cover the basics, but any unexpected expense could rattle his fragile budget. That rainy Tuesday in early spring began like any other, but by mid-morning, his life had shifted forever. The television hummed softly in the corner as he unfolded his lottery ticket, purchased the day before from the gas station near the feed store. The first number rolled across the screen, a match. His heart gave a small leap. The second number matched too, then the third, and by the time all 6 numbers had aligned perfectly, Ben was gripping the counter for balance. $38 million. He sat back in his worn kitchen chair, staring at the ticket as if it might vanish if he blinked. In the quiet hum of his modest home, the enormity of it sank in. Not just the money, but the risk. He knew his family well enough to imagine what would happen if they found out. Over the years, they had treated him like a safety net, always there to catch them when they stumbled. Mark, his son, had borrowed $10,000 for a business idea that turned out to be nothing more than a ski trip with friends. Carla, his daughter, had once asked for help covering her mortgage and never paid him back. Even his niece Angela had leaned on him for rent when her hours were cut. If they learned he had won millions, the calls would come daily, each request wrapped in urgency, each promise of repayment evaporating like morning mist. So Ben made a decision as firm as it was quiet. He would tell no one. The next day, he sat in the polished office of a lawyer downtown, the winning ticket folded neatly in his jacket pocket. Through the window, the drizzle blurred the view of the street as the lawyer explained how to claim the prize through a trust, ensuring his identity remained hidden. Ben nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over him. The money would be secure, invested wisely, unreachable by anyone but him. Yet as he walked back to his truck, another idea crept in, slow and deliberate. He wanted to know who in his family would help him if the situation were reversed. What if he asked for a small loan? Just enough to see who cared without expecting anything in return. By the time he turned the key in the ignition, the plan had taken shape. He would call each family member, tell them he was short on money after an unexpected repair and some medical bills. No drama, just a simple request. Whoever stepped forward would earn a place in the part of his life the lottery had changed. Whoever didn't, well, that would tell him all he needed to know. Ben decided to start with his daughter, Carla, the one who used to call him Dad the Rock when she was younger because she thought he could fix anything. He dialed her number mid-morning, knowing she'd be between her kid's school drop-off and her next Pilates class. She answered on speakerphone, the background noise of clattering dishes and children's chatter flooding his ear. "Hi, Dad. Busy day here. What's going on?" she said brightly. Ben kept his tone low and steady, carefully weaving the story he had practiced the night before. He told her about his old water heater finally giving up, about the medical bills piling up after a couple of doctor visits for chest discomfort, and how his pension check just wouldn't stretch far enough this month. "I'm about $4,000 short, Carla. I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. I can pay you back in a couple of months," he said. There was a pause, just long enough for him to hear her draw in a breath. "Oh, Dad, I wish I could, but we just bought a new SUV last month, and the kids' soccer fees were due. Things are tight. Can't you ask Mark? He's doing pretty well, isn't he?" She replied, her voice already moving toward closure. She offered to ask Paul, her husband, but Ben knew that meant nothing. He ended the call politely, noting her response in a small notebook he had started for this experiment. Next, he rang his son, Mark, later that afternoon. Mark answered on the third ring, his voice casual. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" Ben gave the same story, word for word. Mark chuckled awkwardly and said, "Yikes, Dad, that's rough, but I'm tapped out myself. Taxes hit hard this year. Maybe sell that old boat of yours? That should get you some quick cash." No offer, no suggestion of a smaller amount, not even a promise to think about it. The conversation ended in under 3 minutes. Ben's next stop was lunch with his brother Pete at the diner they'd been going to for decades. Over coffee and a plate of meatloaf, Ben explained his situation. Pete listened with a frown, his fork pushing mashed potatoes around his plate. "You know I'm on a fixed income," Pete said. "If I had it, I'd help, but you're better off going to the bank for a small loan. Interest rates aren't too bad if your credit's still good." Ben nodded and changed the subject, feeling the first hint of disappointment tighten in his chest. That evening, he texted his niece Angela. She was younger, in her 30s, juggling daycare costs for her toddler and rent on a small apartment in Portland. He explained his problem in a brief message, hoping she might at least offer something. Her reply came within minutes. "Sorry, Uncle Ben. Between daycare and rent, we're broke too. Wish I could help." No call, no follow-up questions. Just a short line and the digital equivalent of a shrug. 4 family members down, all of them offering nothing but words. He stared at the notebook page. The neat list of names now followed by the same outcome. No help. The last person on his list was his sister Margaret. She was 3 years older, still spry despite her arthritis, and lived in a small apartment above the library where she worked part-time shelving books. She'd never had much money, never married, and yet she had always been the first to send a birthday card or drop off a pot of soup when he was sick. Ben hesitated before dialing her number, not because he feared rejection, but because she was the one he hoped would surprise him. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Benny? You sound tired. What's the matter?" He told her the story, the same one he had told the others. The line was quiet for half a beat, and then she said without hesitation, "Come by tomorrow. I've got something for you." Ben blinked at the phone, caught off guard by the certainty in her tone. "Margaret, I don't want to put you out." "Nonsense," she interrupted. "Family helps family. I'll see you at lunch." When he hung up, he sat in his recliner, staring at the notes in his book. 4 people had failed his test without even trying. 1 person had passed before he'd even finished explaining. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, the sound of rain tapping against the window. He drove through the damp streets of Eugene, the windshield wipers making a slow, steady rhythm, and pulled up in front of Margaret's modest building. She greeted him at the door in her cardigan and house slippers, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread. She led him to the kitchen table, poured him tea from a chipped pot, and listened as he repeated his troubles. When he finished, she opened a drawer, took out an envelope, and slid it across the table. "There's $2,500 in there," she said simply. "It's my emergency fund. It's not the full amount you need, but it'll get you started." Ben stared at the envelope, his throat tightening. Margaret smiled softly. "You can pay me back when you can, or not at all. I don't care. I just want you to be okay." In that moment, Ben knew his test had already given him the only answer that mattered. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Ben left Margaret's apartment, the envelope of cash tucked carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. As he walked down the narrow staircase to the street, he felt the weight of it. Not the money itself, but what it represented. Margaret, who lived modestly on a part-time library salary, had reached into her own safety net without hesitation, while everyone else he'd tested had found a reason to close their wallets. He drove home slowly, windshield wipers squeaking across the damp glass, his thoughts heavy. The test had been clear. 4 members of his family had failed without even attempting to disguise it, and 1 had passed with quiet, selfless grace. Back in his kitchen, he laid the envelope on the table and sat staring at it for a long while, thinking of all the years he had quietly supported Mark, Carla, Pete, and even Angela in ways they had likely forgotten. The ski trip disguised as a business venture, the mortgage payment Carla swore she'd repay, the times he'd covered Pete's rent when work was slow, and the grocery money he'd slipped to Angela when she was between jobs. Not one of them had offered more than hollow sympathy this time. The silence from them in the days that followed spoke louder than any words could have. He kept the results of his experiment to himself, waiting to see if anyone might follow up. Carla texted him once, a short message asking if he had talked to Mark yet. Mark never called again. Pete sent him a photo of a new fishing rod he'd bought on sale, without a trace of irony. Angela posted vacation photos from the Oregon coast. None of them mentioned his situation. Margaret, however, called him every evening to check in, her voice always warm. "Have you eaten dinner? How's the chest pain?" she'd ask, as if his troubles were her own. 3 days after their lunch, Ben found himself in her apartment again, this time carrying a grocery bag with fresh bread, apples, and the soup she liked. He had decided it was time to tell her the truth. They sat together at the small kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs of tea. "Margaret," he began, fingers drumming lightly against the cup, "I need to come clean about something." She tilted her head, curious but calm. "I didn't really need the money you gave me," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I won the lottery 3 weeks ago. $38 million. Margaret blinked, her lips parting slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to see who would help me if I was in trouble, without expecting anything back. You were the only one who did." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Benny, you're telling me you put me through that because you wanted to test everyone?" "I had to know," he admitted. "I've spent years helping people who never help back. I didn't want this money to make things worse. I needed to see who I could trust." Margaret leaned back, sipping her tea. "Well, I suppose I should be offended, but I'm not. I get it. Our family, well, you know how they are." She smiled faintly. "But Benny, you didn't have to give me anything in return. I'd have done it anyway." "I know," he said quietly, "and that's why I am giving you something. I'm setting up a trust for you. You'll never have to worry about bills again. And I want to buy you a little house near mine, somewhere you can have a garden and a warm kitchen without worrying about rent." Margaret's eyes glistened. "I didn't do it for this," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "and that's exactly why you're getting it." Over the next few weeks, Ben worked with his lawyer to make good on his promise. They found Margaret a small craftsman-style home with a sunny front porch, just a short drive from his own. He set up a monthly stipend from the trust to cover her expenses. She moved in before winter, filling the house with her books, plants, and the smell of fresh bread. As these plans unfolded, Ben kept the rest of the family in the dark. The calls from Carla and Mark dwindled entirely, replaced by the occasional forwarded joke or group text about a distant cousin's birthday. Pete didn't ask about his money trouble again. Angela sent a Christmas card with a short note, but no mention of the loan he had supposedly needed. If they wondered how he was getting by, they didn't ask. One afternoon, as Ben sat in his lawyer's office finalizing the trust paperwork, Philip, his attorney, leaned forward. "What about the rest of your family? Do you intend to tell them eventually?" Ben shook his head. "Not unless there's a good reason. I'm fine with them thinking I scraped by. It's cleaner this way." Philip nodded, making a note. "Sometimes secrecy is the best form of self-preservation." That night, Ben sat on his porch, the cool Oregon air brushing against his face, and thought about how different things could have been if he had announced his win the day it happened. He pictured Carla suddenly finding the time to visit, Mark showing up with a half-baked business plan, Pete hinting about joint investments. The thought made him tired. The truth was, the lottery had given him something far more valuable than money. It had given him clarity. It had shown him the difference between those who cared and those who cared only when there was something to gain. A week later, Margaret came over for Sunday lunch. As they ate, she asked, "Do you regret doing it? The test?" Ben thought for a moment. "No, it hurt, sure, but I'd rather know the truth now than spend the rest of my life wondering." Margaret nodded. "People show you who they are when helping you is inconvenient." "Exactly," Ben said, smiling faintly, "and you showed me who you are." They spent the afternoon on the porch, watching the clouds drift over the Cascades, the silence between them easy and warm. Ben realized then that his fortune wasn't in the bank accounts or investments. It was in moments like this, shared with the one person who had stood by him without condition. In a world where his family's loyalty had proved paper-thin, Margaret's had been solid as stone. And that, he thought, was worth more than any jackpot. Ben knew at some point he needed to close the chapter on his little experiment, even if he never revealed the lottery win to anyone except Margaret. Weeks had passed since he'd first made those calls asking for help, and although the silence from most of his family spoke volumes, there was still a part of him that wanted to face them directly. to look them in the eye and see how they reacted when the subject came up. So, one rainy Saturday morning, he picked up the phone and called each one, inviting them to a family meeting at his house the following weekend. Nothing bad, he assured them, just something important to discuss. Predictably, curiosity outweighed inconvenience. By Sunday afternoon, his living room was full. Carla arrived with Paul, smiling tightly, her eyes scanning the room like she was assessing its resale value. Mark wandered in late, smelling faintly of cologne and beer. Pete leaned in the doorway, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, while Angela sat cross-legged on the couch, fiddling with her phone. Margaret was the last to arrive, giving Ben a knowing smile as she took a seat by the window. Once everyone settled, Ben stood at the center of the room, leaning on the back of his recliner for support. "Thank you all for coming," he began, keeping his tone even. "I wanted to address something that's been floating around. A few weeks ago, I reached out to each of you because I needed help. Financial help." The room shifted uncomfortably. Carla crossed her legs. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "Some of you said you couldn't, some offered suggestions instead of assistance, and some just didn't respond at all," Ben continued, scanning the room slowly. "Now, I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I've sorted my situation out. But I wanted to talk about what happened, not because I need anything from you, but because I think it says something about who we are as a family." Pete snorted softly. "Ben, everyone's got their own bills. It's not like we can just hand over money whenever someone asks." "True," Ben said, nodding. "But I wasn't asking for charity. I said I'd pay it back. I've loaned money to every person in this room at one point or another, sometimes more than once, and I never saw most of it again. But I gave it because I thought that's what family did. Apparently, that's a one-way street." "That's not fair," Carla interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "We've all helped in different ways." "When it was easy for you," Ben cut in, his voice still calm but firmer now. "When it didn't mean you had to go without something you wanted. But when I asked for help, every excuse came out. New cars, bathroom remodels, golf trips, daycare costs, and in Mark's case, just silence." Mark shifted in his seat, eyes dropping to the floor. "I didn't have anything to give," he mumbled. "You could have called," Ben replied quietly. "A phone call doesn't cost anything." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the rain tapping against the windows. Angela finally spoke. "It's not that we didn't care, Uncle Ben. We just didn't know if it was real. It sounded sudden." "That's when you find out if something's real," Ben said, "by showing up and finding out. The only person who did that was Margaret. She didn't ask questions. She didn't check her calendar or her bank balance first. She just said, 'Come over.'" Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, clearly uncomfortable being singled out. Ben let the moment linger, then exhaled slowly. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here because I think it's important we all see things clearly. I don't expect anyone here to change overnight. Yeah, but I do want you to understand that my trust and my willingness to be your safety net has changed." Stephanie, Pete's wife, who had been quiet until now, folded her arms. "So what, you're cutting everyone off?" "I'm setting boundaries," Ben said. "Boundaries that should have been in place a long time ago. I'll still show up for birthdays and holidays. I'll still be your brother, your father, your uncle. But I won't be your lender or your emergency fund. If you get into trouble, you'll have to find another solution." Carla frowned, her voice softening in that way she used when trying to negotiate. "Dad, I think you're being too harsh. We didn't mean to hurt you. We were just overwhelmed." "I was overwhelmed too," Ben replied, "but I still picked up the phone when you needed me. I'm not angry. I'm just done." The group seemed unsure how to respond, the air heavy with a mixture of defensiveness and guilt. No one apologized. No one offered to make amends. Eventually, people began standing, murmuring excuses about needing to get going. One by one, they filed out, leaving the faint smell of damp coats and uneaten cookies behind. Margaret stayed, as Ben knew she would, helping him clear cups and plates from the coffee table. "That could not have been easy," she said softly as she stacked the mugs in the sink. "It was easier than I expected," Ben replied. "I think I've been carrying this for a long time, and now it's just gone." "You're sure you don't want to tell them about the lottery?" she asked, glancing at him. He shook his head. "Not a chance. If they couldn't show up when they thought I had nothing, they don't deserve to show up now that I have everything. Margaret smiled faintly. That's fair. They moved into the living room, settling into their usual spots. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and glistening under the streetlights. Ben leaned back, feeling lighter than he had in years. You know, he said, I used to think the worst thing about getting older was losing people. But sometimes, the best thing is realizing who you're better off without. Margaret reached over and patted his hand. You did good, Benny. Not just for yourself, but for your peace. He looked at her, the one person who had passed his test without knowing it, and felt a quiet surge of gratitude. In the end, the lottery hadn't just bought him comfort, it had bought him clarity. And that, he thought, as they sat in the soft glow of the lamp, was worth more than any dollar amount. A year later, Ben's life bore little resemblance to the one he'd been living on the damp Tuesday morning when those 6 lottery numbers changed everything. His modest bungalow was still his home, but it had been quietly renovated. Fresh paint, a sturdier roof, a new heating system to fight off Oregon's winter chill. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make the neighbors gossip, just quiet improvements that made his days more comfortable. Across town, Margaret's little craftsman house had become a beacon of warmth, its front porch lined with potted flowers in the spring and a wreath in the winter. She'd taken to inviting Ben over twice a week for dinner, cooking hearty stews and fresh bread, though she still claimed she wasn't much of a cook, even as Ben went back for second helpings every time. The trust he'd set up for her meant she no longer had to work at the library, though she still volunteered 3 days a week, shelving books and reading to children. Her health had improved too, thanks to proper medical care and the absence of constant financial worry. Together, they had poured time and money into the small foundation Ben had created quietly under a different name, one dedicated to helping elderly Oregonians who were struggling, covering medical bills, fixing leaky roofs, replacing broken appliances, sometimes just bringing a little company into lonely homes. The work was deeply satisfying, and it filled Ben's days with purpose in a way he'd never experienced during his working years. Not once did he consider telling the rest of his family about the lottery. Carla and Mark had settled into a rhythm of polite distance, calling on birthdays and major holidays, but never delving into real conversations. Pete still sent the occasional text about fishing, but it was always surface level. Angela visited once with her little boy and spent most of the time scrolling on her phone while the child played quietly with the dog. None of them asked how Ben had managed to bounce back after his supposed financial trouble, content to accept the idea that he had simply gotten by through thrift and stubbornness. He preferred it that way. On a brisk autumn evening, Ben and Margaret sat on her porch, steaming mugs of tea warming their hands as the sun sank behind the trees. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and the world was quiet except for the rustle of leaves. You ever think about what it would have been like if you'd told them? Margaret asked. Ben smiled faintly. Sometimes. But then I imagine the constant phone calls, the sudden visits, the sad stories they'd dust off whenever they wanted something. And I remember why I didn't. Margaret nodded knowingly. They'd have been all over you. You'd never know who was real. Exactly, Ben said. Now I do know, and I can keep it that way. He thought of the people they'd helped through the foundation, the widower in Medford whose furnace had died in January, the retired schoolteacher in Bend whose roof had collapsed under snow, the couple in Salem who'd been living without running water because they couldn't afford a well repair. Those people had cried when they received help, not because of the money itself, but because someone had cared enough to step in. That meant more to Ben than any strained holiday dinner with relatives who saw him as a resource instead of a person. Occasionally, moments of temptation surfaced. When Carla complained over the phone about the cost of her kitchen renovation, he thought of offering to cover it, then remembered how quickly she declined his request for help. When Mark hinted at a can't-miss investment opportunity, Ben imagined what he'd say if his son knew about the millions. Each time, he let the moment pass. He didn't need to punish them. He just wasn't going to reward them for failing the simplest test of kindness. The only exceptions he made were anonymous ones. When Pete had a mild stroke and was facing medical bills his insurance didn't fully cover, Ben paid them off through the hospital's patient fund. When Angela's son needed expensive dental work, an unmarked envelope with cash appeared in her mailbox. None of them ever knew where the help came from, and Ben liked it that way. It allowed him to act on compassion without reopening the door to exploitation. That winter, the foundation held its first community event, a small holiday dinner for seniors who lived alone. Ben and Margaret moved between tables, handing out plates of roast turkey and pie, listening to stories from people who'd fought wars, raised families, and worked long, hard years only to find themselves forgotten in their later days. One man, a retired logger named Frank, clasped Ben's hand and said, "You're the first person to knock on my door in 3 months. Feels like someone sees me again." As Ben drove home that night, Margaret dozing in the passenger seat, he thought about how much the lottery had changed. Not in the ways people might imagine, but in the ways that truly mattered. It hadn't bought him luxury or fame. It had bought him the freedom to choose his company, his causes, and his peace. It had stripped away the illusions he'd carried for years about what family meant and replaced them with something stronger, the knowledge of who would stand beside him when he had nothing to give in return. One crisp morning, the following spring, Ben rose early and went fishing alone on the Willamette. The mist clung to the water, and the world was silent, but for the soft plunk of his line hitting the river. As he sat there, he thought about the year behind him, the moment the numbers matched, the calls he made, the disappointment, the one shining exception. He thought about Margaret's laugh, the smell of her bread, the sight of her settling into the home he'd bought her, and the faces of strangers they'd helped. Reeling in his line, he realized the jackpot had never been about the millions. It had been about the clarity. The most valuable prize he'd won was the ability to say, without bitterness, that the people worth keeping close were not those who arrived when you had everything to give, but those who stayed when you had nothing at all. As he packed up his gear and headed back towards shore, Ben smiled to himself, the river sparkling in the early light. He'd kept his secret, and in doing so, he'd found the kind of wealth no lottery could ever buy.